Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Adam Gallagher. I work in the Public Affairs section of U.S. Embassy Tokyo. Today, we are excited to bring you a great virtual program. The topic of today's program is the future of Indo-Pacific security, bolstering regional stability. Joining me today are our speaker, Dr. Michael Green of the United States Study Center, and our moderator, Dr. Takako Hikotani of Gakushuin University. Both are leading experts in Indo-Pacific security studies. Before we begin, I do have just a few administrative items. This session is on the record and will be archived on the U.S. Embassy webpage at a later date. The speaker and moderator are not employees of the United States government, so their remarks and expertise do not represent the official policy of the U.S. government. There will be English and Japanese simultaneous interpretation. And following the speaker's remarks, we will open up the session for questions and answers. We invite you to submit your questions throughout the session in the Q&A box. You can submit questions anonymously in either Japanese or English. Now, let me please introduce Dr. Takako Hikotani, today's moderator. Dr. Hikotani is a professor at Gakushuin University and is one of Japan's leading experts on Japanese politics and foreign and security policy. I would like to now turn the microphone over to Dr. Hikotani.
Thank you very much, Adam. It is a great pleasure and honor for me to moderate today's important session with Dr. Michael Green. Please allow me to start with introducing Dr. Green. Dr. Michael Green is Chief Executive Officer of the United States Studies Center. Previously, Dr. Green was Senior Vice President for Asia at the Center for Strategic International Studies, CSIS, and is currently on leave from Georgetown University, where he was Director of Asian Studies and is Chair in Modern and Contemporary Japanese Politics and Foreign Policy at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service. He served on the staff of the National Security Council at the White House from 2001 through 2005, first as Director for Asia Affairs, and then as Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and Senior Director for Asia. Before joining the NSC staff, he held positions at the Council of Foreign Relations, the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University, the Institute for Defense Analysis, and the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He also worked in Japan on the staff of a member of the National Diet. Dr. Green is currently also Senior Advisor and Henry A. Kissinger Chair at CSIS and Distinguished Guest Scholar at the Asia Pacific Initiative in Tokyo. He serves on the boards of the Asia Foundation and the Radio Free Asia, the advisory board of the Center for New American Security, and advisory council of the Bush Institute, and senior advisor to the Asia Group. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and Aspen Strategy Group. Dr. Green has authored numerous books and articles on Indo-Pacific security, including most recently, Line of Advantage, Japan's Grand Strategy in the Era of Abe Shinzo, and By More Than Providence, Grand Strategy and American Power in the Asia Pacific since 1783. I need to point out that both books have Japanese translations, which is extremely important. By More Than Providence was my top book that I assigned for my U.S. Policy in East Asia class at Columbia when I taught U.S. Foreign Policy. And Line of Advantage was translated by Nikkei in August 2023, and I've been using this book on Japanese foreign policy here at Gakushuin University. It really helps to have two languages available to teach a group of students who are international, and it's been a great asset for me when I teach. And so I'm very privileged to do this today. I need to take a screenshot of us together so I can brag to my students that I'm on the same screen as Dr. Green. But I'd like to stop here and turn the mic over now to Dr. Green for his opening presentation. Thank you. To you.
Thanks very much, Takako. Thank you, Adam. If you do a screenshot, I'll send an email verifying it's not a deep fake. But it's really a pleasure to be with you. I'm in Sydney, Australia, where I've been running a think tank for the past 2 years. It's been very, very interesting working on this region from Australia and seeing how important and how dynamic Australia's relations with Japan are, the multipolarity in this region with the Quad, with AUKUS, with the UK. It's given me a very different perspective. And the weather is also very nice. It's summer right now, so I hope you'll forgive me wearing cool biz, even though it's winter in Tokyo. I thought I would talk to you about the current geopolitical dynamics that are setting the stage for American and Japanese strategic decisions. Focus a bit on the role of Japan, and in particular, the contribution of former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo in creating a strategic framework that is now being followed by many democracies who are confronting this geopolitically challenging region and era. And then finally, a few thoughts on what has to happen next, what the Trump administration should be doing, how Japan should work with the US. And then I look forward to a dialogue with Takako and then your questions. So we are in the most contested geopolitical environment since the end of the Cold War, and arguably even going back further. The Chinese, Russian, Iranian, and North Korean strategies for the period from the 90s to the 2015 timeframe aimed at clawing back at eroding American alliances in their separate regions, in East Asia, in Central Europe, in the Middle East. But they were separate, and they were not coordinated. And for China, and to some extent Russia, they were predicated on economic interdependence and good relations with important economies. We're now in a very different period, and it really changed with the Ukraine war, even though the elements were always there. Historians like Hal Brands at Johns Hopkins estimate that the level of strategic competition, the level of strategic cooperation between China and Russia, and also North Korea and Iran, that coordination, that alignment in terms of military cooperation, technology transfer, diplomatic alignment, propaganda coordination, that level of coordination and alignment is greater than the alignment between Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany in the Second World War. And I think that assessment is correct. As a result, it is not surprising that the US network of bilateral alliances, the so-called San Francisco Treaty System, named after the 1951 agreements that established the US-Japan alliance, ANZUS with Australia and so forth. It's not surprising those bilateral alliances are increasingly becoming networked. The Biden administration calls it lattice work. Prime Minister Ishiba has called for a NATO, which is quite ambitious, but the trend is very clear. There is more collective security effort across more domains by core US allies, not only with the US, but with each other, than we've ever seen in the post-war period. It includes things like the US, Japan, Australia trilateral security relationship, which is much, much deeper than most people realize, with agreements a week ago in Darwin in the Northern Territories of Australia between Defense Minister Nakatani, Defense Secretary Austin of the US, and Deputy Prime Minister and Defense Minister Richard Marles of Australia, to really integrate trilateral exercises, technology sharing. You will now regularly see Japanese fighter squadrons, amphibious battalions and brigades operating in Australia. The US, Japan, the US, Australia, and the United Kingdom are embarking on one of the most, perhaps the most significant technology collaboration since the Cold War in AUKUS, which will produce nuclear-powered submarines for Australia and integrate advanced technology development. Japan has been invited to participate in Pillar 2, not the submarine part, but the technology part. Despite troubled Japan-Korea political relations, the US-Japan-Korea defense and diplomatic relationship trilaterally has recovered from a long winter. The Philippines, India in the Quad, and of course NATO because European allies see North Korean troops fighting in Europe, and Asian allies see an authoritarian state trying to conquer a democracy, and worry that that would send the wrong signal to Xi Jinping or Kim Jong-un. So this integration of alliances, while it's not a NATO, is moving in that direction and is not going backwards. This is not a trend that will reverse. Now, it is one that's going to require a broader way of thinking, because what Beijing is doing, often in concert with Russia, is a multi-domain assault on the existing order and on U.S. alliances and on the security and territorial integrity of Japan, India, Korea, and others. It involves, of course, diplomatic efforts to woo third countries to their side. It involves military and paramilitary coercion, cyber. It involves infrastructure financing for dual-use military ports and facilities around the Indo-Pacific. It involves a very intensive information campaign that you could call propaganda, but it's more sophisticated than propaganda. And frankly, it's quite effective. Not in Japan, not in the US, not really in Korea. But if you go to the Pacific Islands or parts of South or Southeast Asia, the information campaign by China and Russia around Taiwan, Ukraine, Gaza is very effective. So it's a multi-front, multi-domain competition. It's one that pulls US allies together, but also NATO allies. And it's one that is extremely challenging for democracies to keep up. And particularly because of economic interdependence with China. The trend is for economies like Japan, Korea, many in Europe, certainly the United States, to de-risk from the Chinese economy. The term the Trump administration will probably use is disentangle. It's okay to export commodities. It's okay to sell municipal bonds to China. But when it comes to manufacturing and technology, the goal of the Trump administration will be, like the Biden administration, to weaken dependence on China, but it will accelerate under Trump. And the term of art will be disentangling. And that's complicated for countries, even for the US. In Japan, Korea, Australia trade more with China than the US most years. Korea is now shifting. Japan is shifting. Foreign direct investment between the US and Japan, Korea, Australia, or India is much, much higher than anything China does. But trade, there's definitely trade dependence. Not even that easy for the US. The US only trades about 8% of its trade with China, compared to Japan, which is 20-some%, Australia, which is 30-some%. So only 7-8% for the US, but the volume of that trade with China is larger than the combined trade with China of Japan, Korea, and Australia. So this complicates it. It would be much easier if it were the Cold War and we didn't have economic interdependence. It's also complicated by nuclear weapons, which keep the peace through deterrence, but we're not sure how credible extended deterrence is. And it's complicated by the fact that much of the so-called global South doesn't want to be involved. Many countries are happy to profit from it, Vietnam in particular, as supply chains and production shifts away from China. But they don't want to be caught in the strategic competition. And they are, as many of them are, post-colonial states where China's Asia for Asians, anti-Western propaganda can sometimes resonate. And finally, it's complicated by the fact that Western democracies are struggling with the post-industrial era, inflation, and a growing gap between rich and poor, which is why Donald Trump won. It's why Ishiba-san did so badly. It's why the New Zealand government changed. You don't want to be an incumbent right now. There's broad consensus, bipartisan consensus in the US, in Japan, in Australia, mostly in Korea, about the strategy that we are undertaking. But the bandwidth to enact it is limited by the fact that the public wants cheaper prices. So big challenges. I think the discipline that will get us through came from Prime Minister Abe Shinzo's free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. I had the great privilege of working with Abe-san. I was in the White House. He was Deputy Chief Cabinet Secretary and then Cabinet Secretary to Prime Minister Koizumi Junichiro, and I stayed in close touch ever since. When he was out of power, he studied strategy, he studied history. I was able to participate in some of the Benkyokai, the study groups he held. He came back to office in 2012, as I describe in my book, with a very coherent strategic concept for how to maintain a free and open Indo-Pacific. It involved deeper ties with the US, which he effected through the revision of how Article 9 and collective self-defense are interpreted. But it also involved deeper strategic connections to Australia and India through the Quad, and active diplomacy and infrastructure financing to help make the Pacific Islands, South and Southeast Asia, more resilient, to give them more agency. It was a brilliant strategy. It had its flaws. It was a bit weak on South Korea. Abe-san had a penchant for interpreting history in ways that made Koreans uncomfortable, and even sometimes Australians and Americans. But it was the most comprehensive strategy for how to deal with this new strategic environment without war that anyone came up with, and incredibly influential. Donald Trump administration adopted the free and open Indo-Pacific. The Biden administration came in, they wanted a new name because free and open Indo-Pacific was Trump's. And then Kurt Campbell and others told the president, no, this isn't Trump's strategy, this is Abe's strategy. So Biden kept it. Australia's approach reflects this. The European allies, Korea has an Indo-Pacific strategy. Really, really important contribution in terms of framing how we compete without catastrophe, and the importance of a multipolar Asia, of the agency and the role that Japan or Australia or Korea can play. So what do we do next? The Trump administration will be, well, they already are starting in some ways. He's already making pronouncements, and they'll take office January 20th. I actually think, having written a history of American strategy in Asia since 1783, that there's going to be far more continuity than change in the US approach to Asia. If you think about it, the Quad, the US, Japan, Australia, India Quad, it started when I was in the White House under George W. Bush, but it was brought back by the Trump administration as a foreign ministers meeting. The free and open Indo-Pacific concept. The Trump administration was very focused on enhancing deterrence. Marco Rubio, the new Secretary of State, Mike Waltz are very familiar with and strongly supportive of our alliances in the region. But there will be some uncertainty with this new government. How far will Donald Trump go with tariffs? Will the view that the US has to pivot away from NATO to compete in China become the main strategy for Donald Trump? Probably not, but there will be a lot of debates, and Japan will have an important role in those debates. So I think it's not too soon for Japan and the US, for experts, government, members of parliament, diplomats, to be thinking about what the agenda should be. And I would end with a few highlights of what should get attention. First, I think it'll be really important to build on the connectivity and integration and accepted interdependence of the US and Japan and other allies. This means moving rapidly on command and control relationships, the new 4-star position in Japan, but also greater connectivity with Australia and more security, maritime security cooperation in the Quad. I think it will be really important to accelerate efforts beyond what we have done to enhance deterrence in the near term. Japan has done a lot. 2% of GDP defense spending is a good goal. Trump might ask for more, we'll see. But it will be important to not let bureaucratic red tape get in the way of delivering deterrent capabilities, Tomahawk, munitions, for Japan, but also for Australia, for the US. I think that it will be really important for Japan in particular to keep moving forward with the US, Japan, Korea trilateral relationship. Donald Trump was not very interested in that, but his officials were. And a lot of this will be on the US, but frankly, a proactive approach by Japan will help. We did a survey at my center of defense experts in Japan and the US and Australia, and over 80% of defense experts in Japan and 100% of defense experts in Australia and the US said, moving forward, Japan-Korea security cooperation and US-Japan-Korea trilateral security cooperation is critical. Over 80% of Japanese defense experts. So if it's good for Japan's national security, it will be important for the government to not let politics get in the way. On the deterrence question, we have a challenge, which is China is surprising us. Russia is surprising us. We surprise them sometimes. AUKUS was a big surprise, pooling US, Australian, and British technology to to maintain the strong asymmetrical advantage the US has and its allies have in submarines and undersea warfare, one of the weak points, the Achilles heels for China. I think the Camp David agreement, the US, Japan, Korea Camp David summit, was a strategic surprise for China. These are strategic surprises that are good. It shows the consequences of China's coercion. It shows that the US and its allies can seize the initiative. You know, New Zealand and Canada sending frigates through the Taiwan Strait was a surprise. It showed that these relatively smaller militaries and countries have the courage to stand up for their interests and their principles. We need to be thinking about how we seize the initiative. The challenge with Donald Trump is he loves surprises, including surprising allies. Surprising allies is not how you seize the initiative. China will be thrilled every time Donald Trump shocks and surprises allies. So I think Japan and other allies should be going into the new administration early with things we can do to seize the initiative that are together. And then the last thing, which I'd end with, Takako, is you know, in strategy, when strategy is taught at the military academies, and Takako, you taught at the Defense Academy, maybe you use the same framework, but it's taught that you need to think about all the instruments of national power across what's called the DIME spectrum. D is diplomacy, I is or intelligence, M is military tools, E is economic tools. The US economy is doing very well on a macro level. Inflation's bad, people are unhappy, but on a macro level, the US economy is doing well. Innovation is thriving, energy self-sufficiency is taking root. And US foreign direct investment flows between the major economies in Asia, other than China, and the US are quite robust. But in terms of writing the rules for trade and investment, the US has really retreated. Donald Trump pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. President Biden refused to join. Instead, he introduced the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF. It's not enough. It's just not enough. While Donald Trump champions tariffs, it is worth remembering that he signed trade agreements. He signed an agreement with Japan, and he signed one with the US, Canada, and Mexico. He's now threatening to rip up the one with Canada and Mexico. But in those trade agreements, there were new chapters on digital trade. So I'd really encourage Japanese friends, US officials and scholars to think about what can the US and Japan do as the core, with others like Australia playing a key role, to develop a strategy to enhance our collective influence on rulemaking in Asia around digital trade and services, environmental goods and services, infrastructure, quality infrastructure financing. We should be proactive. And I just conclude, Takako, by saying the Trump administration will bring some real anxiety. It will bring some surprises, but the basic foundations of the US-Japan alliance and American strategy in Asia are not changing. And rather than wait to see what a new Trump administration will do, I think it's time to start telling them what they should do. Frame it in terms that make sense to the incoming administration, but there's a lot Japan can bring to the table. So look forward to the dialogue with you, Takako, and the questions from the audience, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Green. That was very sweeping and I think very reassuring to the Japanese audience that I think is often said that we're not as panicking maybe as the NATO countries, and some worry about the fact that we might seem a little bit complacent. But I think you gave us points that does not make us complacent, but things to work on concretely. So can I start with asking you about the US-Japan ROK? Because I think we both heard Ambassador Emmanuel talk about that to be his greatest accomplishment, and that I think at a meeting, I heard him say that the secret was that the US was not at the forefront in a way, and that it worked very well in the back to make things happen. But how much are you worried that domestic politics might lead to things unraveling especially, I guess, what I'm worried about the recent incident about the at the Sado Kinzan, the ceremony, that things like that could happen. Are you concerned that that might be a sign of difficulties going forward, or are you more confident about the stability of the relationship? It's a good thing that now there's a secretariat that is created. So I think there's a lot of effort to institutionalize. But how confident are you that this is going to be something going forward that is more resilient?
So I have tried to play a role in the US-Japan-Korea trilateral relationship for over 25 years. I was a new PhD, taught at SAIS for a year, and then I went into the Pentagon to help Joe Nye and Kurt Campbell with the famous Nye Initiative. But one of my responsibilities was staffing the first trilateral US-Japan-Korea defense talks. And it was very hard, but we did it. And if you had said to me at the time, where will the three countries be in 25 years? I would have said much further along than we actually are, because we have 2 steps forward and then some political thing happens and then it's 1 step back, sometimes 5 steps back. The Japanese defense minister just, is having the first meeting in something like 15 years between the defense ministers. Right. I think I have that number right. So I do worry about it because both countries' domestic politics are, ripe. I think there are some structural factors that will continue pushing Japan and Korea to cooperate. The Korean public's support for the US alliance is 90%, Japanese public 90%, both very, very strongly committed. I don't know if we deserve it in the US, but both Korea and Japan share a very strong commitment to the US alliance network. The views of China are equally negative. Both Koreans and Japanese publics have almost the same negative view of China. But Korea, I think, feels much more vulnerable. Japan's an island. Korea's right next to North Korea. It's just much more vulnerable economically and strategically to China. In some ways, it needs China for the Korean Peninsula. I think some in Korea overestimate how much China is really going to help them, but it is a factor. The politics in Korea are very divided. A bit like the US, except that it goes all the way back to the Korean War. So that's all very, very complicated. And I am worried about it. The US role is really the linchpin for the trilateral defense and intelligence and diplomatic cooperation. But the US cannot play a leading role on the bilateral political issues. At most, the US government can be what's called an intellectual facilitator. And I did this when I was in government, going to Korean friends and saying, hey, did you see that really nice thing about Korea that the Japanese foreign minister just said? And just sort of like nakodo, like a go-between, but not really able to lead because frankly, that both Japan and Korea have complicated historical relations with the US too, not as complicated. So it really depends on political leadership in Tokyo and Seoul. And my sense is Ishiba-san understands this. I think Yoon understands this in Korea, but we don't know how long Ishiba-san will be in power, and we don't know what will happen in the Korean election. So short answer is yes, I worry about it. Should be the highest priority, frankly, for the next administration in North Asia. I'm not sure if it will be, but it should be.
Right. Thank you. Arranged marriages are not really fashionable these days either. So maybe you need to have the love happening, Ashley, and hopefully that would happen. But the second question has to do with, this is something that we have received as questions beforehand, is about the future of the minilaterals, other than just the US-Japan ROK, in general, the Quad, or now the current Biden administration calls it the lattice work. Maybe the Trump administration would not use the word lattice, but I don't know what the different word is. But how do you think about the current arrangements? Is it going to institutionalize them further because of the strategic imperatives, or do you think there's any chance that maybe they'll exist, but the U.S. will gradually not be part? What's your view on those? Can you
Well,
just
yeah, I don't think these unilaterals are going to work without the U.S.
Right.
And I don't think that they're hedging. You know, when Donald Trump was running in 2016, a very prominent Japanese scholar who we both know said to me that if Donald Trump gets elected, Japan's going to have a plan B. I said, oh, what's plan B? And this person said, plan B is to work very closely with Australia and India and others in the Indo-Pacific. And I said, oh, good, that's great, because I advised Jeb Bush, and before that, Mitt Romney, and before that, John McCain. And what you just described was our plan A for American strategy. There's no contradiction between strong connectivity between Japan and other countries, especially Australia as the closest, and a strong alliance with the US. They're very complementary. And sometimes, frankly, a close alignment between Japan and Australia, or Japan and Korea, helps to discipline the American system. So it's not going to end up, replacing the U.S. And let's face it, the U.S. military power, nuclear weapons, strategic reach you can't replace that, and especially the collective security and the mutual defense commitment. So the more the merrier, and I think there's bipartisan consensus about that in the U.S. These minilaterals are becoming much more dynamic. The Federation of Defense Production, I think there's a very strong possibility that the Australian Navy will introduce the Mogami as its next frigate. The Korean company Hanwha is building howitzers and things in Australia for a regional and global market. AUKUS, there is all these connectivities, these federations of defense production. The diplomacy is being more connected. Development finance with JBIC, Japan Bank for International Cooperation, is of a lattice work and federated. And things like the Quad, TSD, the Squad with the Philippines are taking on more of security, but they do not provide the kind of collective defense deterrent that NATO does. We don't have a joint and combined command and control. We don't have joint planning. That's the part that's not there. And I think it will only happen in bits and pieces, especially with US, Japan, and Australia, unless China goes too far. And then I think you will find that there's more of that. Not a broad Asian NATO, but you might see more collective defense. It's a bit of a deterrent for China, because they will realize the harder they push, the more they're going to create what they don't want, which is an Asian NATO. So I don't think that's the plan, and I don't think it's likely, but I think it's a useful reminder of Beijing that this outcome could be your fault. It helps with deterrence in itself.
Thank you. So you mentioned the Quad, and one country that we haven't specifically discussed is India. And that, what do you think about the relationship going forward? It is well known that incoming President Trump and Mr. Modi seems to have like a good chemistry, so to speak. But what do you think about the relationship going forward, and how would that affect the future of the Quad?
Well, the Indian diaspora in the United States is becoming increasingly influential and powerful. Look at all the Indian Americans who are prominent on both sides of the aisle, Vivek Ramaswamy and Vice President Harris herself, who have, to India. Same thing in Australia. The Indian diaspora is becoming more and more important. That really provides a glue. It's interesting, when Modi went to the US, he went to Texas, and he had a huge rally with the Indian community called Howdy Modi in Texas, Howdy Modi. And he went to Australia, and he went to Parramatta in the west of Sydney, which has a very large concentration of Indian immigrants, and he did a G'day Modi. I don't know what you do in Japan. There aren't as many Indian immigrants, but that diaspora, that connectivity is very, very powerful. The India-Japan relationship is very strong. It has there was not much there before around 2006, but it has grown regardless of who's in power in Tokyo and New Delhi. It's just got its own trajectory. Australia, India is more up and down. Labor parties had more difficulty with India, but now the Labor Party of Prime Minister Albanese has embraced the Quad. The first thing Albanese did after he got elected, the very first day, was fly to Tokyo for a Quad summit. And as I was saying earlier, the Quad was formed when I was in the White House by the Bush administration, but it was resurrected by the Trump administration, elevated to a summit by Biden. So I think the Quad has very strong foundations. The one thing I don't know is, will Donald Trump personally join the summits? My guess is he will, right, because Modi will ask him. So the Quad's going to be a very, very important part. But the Quad's, it has it's a bit amorphous. The agenda changes depending on circumstances. It's not a NATO, that's for sure. But I think as a feature of multilateralism, it's going to grow in prominence.
Thank you. So let me turn to the question about China. And that is, you said that probably the terminology that might be used will be disentanglement. But you were in Japan, in Tokyo recently, and I'm sure you met with business leaders. Did you have a sense that maybe there might be some concerns about the level of disentanglement that might differ between the US and China, Japan and China, and that will cause some difficulties between the two countries?
Yeah, I think that's going to be a problem for pretty much every US ally. Part of the reason is that the US disentanglement is being driven by national security and not just economic concerns. And so the national security push for disentanglement is not as strong in Australia or Japan or Korea, because the national security establishment is not as powerful as in the US. And, for that reason, and also that Japan and Korea for exports and manufacturing depends on China. It has a middle class the size of the US. And for Australia, it's exports of iron ore in particular that really have paid for the Australian welfare state. So the level of interdependence is clearly higher, and the anxiety in the private sector is higher. There are US companies like Apple and Tesla, Elon Musk company, that are equally dependent on China, even more so in some ways. But more broadly, the US economy has, despite the high volumes of trade, more latitude to disentangle and more, I guess, pressure from the national security community. That said, when I talk to CEOs in Japan, I find many of them something very interesting, which is they know that this profitable ride with China will not last forever. They know that the intellectual property rights theft, the high cost of labor in China, and the Chinese use of embargoes and other economic weapons mean that they have to reduce their dependence on the China market. But it's such a big economy, there's so much money, they don't want to. So there are these debates. How do we, de-risk? How do we do China plus one? How much? Well, we don't want to have our profits go down this quarter. I think that the US push for disentanglement will affect those debates, and that most companies will decide, well, we have to do it sooner or later. Let's start to de-risk faster than we were. But decoupling, just pulling out investments, that's not something that Japan or Korea or Australia can do. And they will say that loud and clear to the US side, and there will be a little bit of friction, but the US cannot, the Trump administration cannot implement its China strategy without allies. Semiconductors is a good example. The US under Biden, began under Trump, under Biden, will accelerate under Trump, is severely limiting the export of high-end semiconductors to China. It really only captures about 2% of all semiconductor exports, but it's the most high-end semiconductors. And the reason is because they're so critical to AI, and AI is critical to national power and warfare. The US couldn't do that unilaterally. The most important producers are in Japan, Korea, and the Netherlands. So there's going to have to be a discussion at the table, and it's going to have to be strategic, and it will accelerate more than Biden, but it won't be complete decoupling because the U.S. can't order Japan or Korea to do that, and the U.S. can't threaten because we need Japan and Australia in particular to maintain our forward military presence and our strategy. So there's a lot of contradictions in Trump's worldview and the Trump vision. You know, tariffs, but people don't want high prices. Well, tariffs cause high prices. Decoupling, but we need Japan. There's a lot of contradictions that Japanese and Australian and other diplomats are going to be sorting out at the table in a very interesting couple of months.
Talking about contradictions or puzzles or surprising aspects of the Trump administration, one country we haven't really talked about is North Korea. And some argue that the incoming Principal Deputy National Security Advisor, the appointment announcement of Alex Wong suggests that maybe Trump is interested in North Korea and to continue revive whatever relationship with Kim Jong-un. What are your thoughts about anything surprising happening? Do you think it's something that to watch, to concern us, or what do you think about Trump's policy towards North Korea? That's actually one of the questions that was raised by our audience.
Well, Alex Wong had a particular responsibility for North Korea diplomacy, but he had a broader mandate when he was in the administration. He worked on strategy towards the entire region. I don't personally think he's going to that job because of North Korea. I think it's because they wanted a trusted person who'd advised President Trump before on Asia more broadly. I suspect Donald Trump would love to have an event. You know, a lot of his strategy is a bit like Las Vegas boxing or casinos. He wants a really big show and a great photo op and a sort of historic headline. So he's probably tempted to do something big with Kim Jong-un, but it's a very different situation. North Korea, Kim Jong-un has clearly stated he's not interested in diplomacy. He's not interested in unification, and he's not giving up his nuclear weapons. China and Russia have aligned together in ways that give Kim Jong-un a better deal pursuing nuclear weapons capabilities. Maybe there'll be a test, I don't know, but certainly missiles. That's a better deal for him than what he thinks he can get from Donald Trump. And what we learned last time was that although President Trump was willing to have a Las Vegas style pro wrestling match, big media circus summit, behind closed doors, he actually was not willing to give up very much. And he'll be even less willing to do so now, I think, because of what happened to President Biden in Afghanistan. Biden personally insisted on a unilateral pullout from Afghanistan. It was a disaster, especially politically. I mean, it was a disaster, frankly, for many Afghans and some U.S. Marines, but it was a political disaster for Biden. His support rate dropped in July of 2021, and it never recovered. And the Trump people know that unilateral withdrawal is political suicide. So we may have some drama around North Korea, but I think there will be some checks and balances. I think, you know, we're guessing a bit, but that would be my assumption.
Okay. Let me pick up another question from the question box. Regarding the possible Taiwan contingency, Taiwan, Philippines, and Japan will be our front line. And so some experts say that the Japan, US, Taiwan, Philippines cooperation is the most important and highly anticipated than US, Japan, ROK. What do you think of those four countries, four actors' current security cooperation, and what should be done under the next Trump administration? So Philippines, Taiwan, Japan, US.
Philippines really is in the front line. When I worked in the Pentagon 20-some years ago, we had the Taiwan crises in the 1990s. The U.S. was able to send 2 carrier battle groups through the South China Sea with no problem. The Chinese strategy and the U.S. view was this was a cross-strait military problem. But now it's a theater-wide problem. The Chinese strategy is to embark on a theater-wide campaign. That's why they want submarine bases in the Pacific Islands to corner Australia. It's why they want submarine bases and military bases in Cambodia and Pakistan and Djibouti to make sure the U.S. Fifth Fleet is challenged coming across the Indian Ocean. It's why they're exercising near Guam. They want to push everyone back. It's a theater campaign. And the Philippine Sea and the Philippine archipelago is absolutely critical front line in all of this. President Marcos, when he came in, was a question mark. You know, his father was basically pushed out by Ronald Reagan because of his opposition to democracy and the protests and violence in Manila. People didn't know what Marcos would think. He tried an overture to China, and the Chinese treated him very badly. And the Marcos government is now moving forward very significantly with the U.S. and Japan out of their own national interest, because they realize that Beijing sees them as a highway to get into the Pacific Ocean and outflank Taiwan and Japan. And they don't want that. And it's a very positive part of the Biden administration's legacy. The challenge we have on the Democratic side, we have many challenges: economic interdependence, the global South. One challenge we have is that China and Russia, Iran and North Korea can approach these problems with unity of effort within their countries. Like, nobody who objects to Xi Jinping's foreign policy lasts long, or Putin's, whereas we're open democracies. And so fortunately, there's bipartisanship in the US and Japan and Australia, so there are only fairly minor changes. I think with the Korean government, if the left comes in, you get bigger changes, but still the alliance with the US is pretty solid. Philippines, you get the biggest swings of all of the frontline states, because Sara Duterte's view is not really the same as President Marcos. What do we do about it? I think Japan has an excellent relationship with the Philippines. I don't think we isolate the opposition, we engage them, and we contribute however we can to a bipartisan continuity. It'll be our fault if we can't collectively, Japan is particularly well regarded in the Philippines, it'll be our fault if we can't make the case, as we have in so many countries, for cooperation among ourselves to protect our interests and our values.
Thank you. There is a question also about Japan's role. What can Japan do for making the US realize again the importance of free trade? And is there a specific area in which Japan can contribute to the US? And I think you mentioned Japan's important role in the G7 as the, I guess it was better known during the Abe administration, how he could be sort of the bridge between Mr. Trump and somebody else, the other more apprehensive European countries. Right now, it doesn't really seem like Mr. Ishiba's going to play that role, at least at this point. So what do you think Japan, US, what the role Japan can play within the G7? What kind of specific suggestions you might have as something that we can look forward to? And maybe Japan can think ahead. And the other part is Japan and Asia, and how Japan could be a bridge between US and Asia. That's always been something that's been easier said than done. But are there some specific proposals? Because you mentioned at the end of your presentation, it's really important to seize the initiative. And right now, we don't really see that unfold because we're all in a very difficult domestic politics situation. But he were to advise Mr. Prime Minister Ishiba about seizing the initiative. What are the suggestions you might make with regards to Japan and G7 and Japan and Asia?
So Abe was probably the most effective world leader at advancing his country's interests with the Trump administration. And it was because he was patient. He came into conversation saying what Japan can do, not what Japan can't do. So that's critical. You'll remember, or at least have read about, the Gulf War in 1990, when the Kaifu administration was being pushed by the US to contribute. And the foreign ministry spokesman said, we'll give this much money and not a dollar more. What we can't do is the Cold War era Japanese diplomatic stance. The Koizumi Abe diplomatic stance is, yes, we can. Here's what Japan can do. Here's what we can do. I remember during the Iraq War, Prime Minister Koizumi told President Bush, we're going to be able to contribute to recovery of Iraq, and we're going to go to the Europeans and Gulf states and put pressure on them to contribute too. It was such a signature change for people like Rich Armitage or Torkel Patterson, who I worked with, who'd been in the administration during the Gulf War, when Japan's stance was, no, we can't. So, so it's really important to say what Japan can do, and there's a lot. I think Japan, because of the G7, has the most important role of any country in the world in linking the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific theaters. Abe was excellent in the G7. You know, some of the European leaders, Macron, Trudeau in Canada, they were under pressure from their publics to criticize Trump or distance themselves from Trump. Abe was, I'm told, quite unhappy with them because they were putting the G7 at risk. So I think not just bridging the Pacific, but bridging the Euro-Atlantic, Japan and the G7 is really well positioned to calm down the Europeans. You know, the election of Trump is being met by panic in Western Europe, not everywhere in Europe, but in Western Europe. Mixed reactions in Asia. The one part of the world that's quite happy is the Middle East, and the Saudis, the Gulf states, Israel. Iran's not happy. That's why they're happy. I think Abe did a good job sort of keeping the Europeans focused on the positive and the proactive agenda and not just complaining about Trump all the time. And that, frankly, used to be Britain's role. But I think it's more credible now, frankly, in many ways coming from Japan. So the G7 role is critical, and that means thinking of a proactive agenda. There'll be a lot of people coming into the Trump administration looking for ideas. That's why Free and Open Indo-Pacific was picked up by them last time. Countering economic embargoes and coercion. The G7, largely with Japan's initiative, issued a statement a little over a year ago on the importance of cooperating to counter embargoes and coercion from China. We'll put more into that, make it more concrete. That's the kind of thing. Solidifying the view from Asia and Europe with the IP4, Japan, Australia, Korea, New Zealand, participation in NATO. Solidify the idea that the US cannot pivot from Europe to Asia without damaging Asia's security. So Japan's really in a pivotal role. And within Asia, Japan is the most trusted country everywhere except Korea and China, by far. So infrastructure financing, bridging where there are difficulties. When Duterte was president, Abe played a critical role keeping the Philippine alliance with the US together. But the hardest job in Asia, and as we were discussing earlier, maybe the most important, is Korea. And a lot of Japanese political leaders don't want to use their political capital on relations with Korea. There's no votes in it. But it is strategically the area where Japan can have, although it's painful, the biggest influence in Asia. So those are some areas. And I find the Japanese Foreign Ministry in particular is very proactive. It's one of the most proactive and strategic foreign ministries in the world right now. And Ishiba-san has some political challenges he'll have to overcome. But I think the ambassador in Washington, the NSC staff, really first rate and thinks proactively and strategically. That's not how Gaimusho Foreign Ministry used to be, as you know, but much more proactive. And there'll be a lot of people in the US State Department, in DFAT in Australia, looking for ideas. So there will be willing partners in this effort to try to come up with a menu that's in Japan's interests and in US interests for when the new administration comes in.
Thank you. I guess we're almost at the end of our session, but it's interesting that we don't really talk about the Japan-US alliance itself anymore, that we talk more about the relationship in a broader context. But I think it's also very notable that Prime Minister Kishida and the message to the conference said, basically the message was not just yes, we can, but you're not alone. And I think that was very important, interesting, and a turning point. Is there some things about the bilateral alliance maybe we're expecting the improvement in the command structure cooperation? Is there something specific that you'd like to see happen at the alliance itself? If we can just turn to that at the end.
You know, when I was a new PhD student in the 90s, and I was arguing that that Japan's foreign policy and national security strategy would shift ever more in the direction of what we would call realism, meaning focused on balance of power because of the rise of China. A lot of people criticized me, to be honest, and thought, no, the future of Asia is going to be a multilateral, system like the EU, which would be great. It's clearly not going to happen. For that reason, structurally, the U.S.-Japan alliance has a very logical framework behind it. But a lot of other things have happened too. Japanese foreign direct investment in the U.S. is incredibly important. During the global financial crisis and during COVID, Japanese companies, Nissan, Toyota, Canon, they were about the only companies in the US that didn't fire anyone. And all across America in small towns, and especially industrial parts that voted for Donald Trump, or deindustrialized parts, Japan's really viewed affectionately. There's an appreciation. I think the other factor which is related to those is, when I was in the Pentagon, we sometimes struggled to put out joint statements saying we have common values. I think, people will look at this cynically and say, no, we don't. But honestly, there are differences, of course, but I think there is a very deep recognition in the publics and the governments that even though our democracies are different, and even though we each have our own flaws, America's are on full display, but Japan's got problems too. Even though our democracies are different, there's something fundamental about living in an open society that's at threat right now. And so all those reasons, I think, make the alliance very, very strong. We used to worry a lot about gender in the alliance, that most of the people working in the alliance were men, but that's changed. There's so many, I think, women on both sides who are becoming leading thinkers on the alliance. So there's a lot of good stories. The homework really is bureaucratically difficult, not culturally difficult, in my view. So command and control requires some real hard bureaucratic decisions to get this U.S. 4-star, to get Japan's defense establishment engaged in planning, to get security clearances and cyber security. These are bureaucratically very complicated and hard for Japan and for the U.S. to clear the way for transfer of Tomahawk or other capabilities to Japan requires a lot of bureaucratic work in the U.S. So those are all important and hard work. We don't have the luxury of taking our time. There's an urgency to restoring deterrence. I think Ishima-san knows this because of his time as defense minister. I don't know that Donald Trump himself does, but the incoming Trump administration is going to really be focused on this. So it's not a cultural problem. Obviously, there are cultural differences. Obviously, pacifism is still quite powerful in Japan. That's a big difference, as you know well from your writing and teaching. But honestly, to me, the hardest difficulties now are bureaucratic. It's mechanical stuff. It's hard work, what we're trying to do.
But thank you. On this note that basically, there might be some bureaucrats listening to this webinar today that you have given some homework to them. But I think we're on a relatively, positive note right now about the relationship, not just alliance itself, but what the two countries can do together to the region around the world. And on that positive note, I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Gallagher now to end the session. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Dr. Green and Dr. Hikotani, for that really, really interesting conversation. And I know I said at the top, Dr. Green's remarks do not necessarily reflect those of the U.S. government. I really think his central message that there will be more continuity than change going forward, that really rings true here at the embassy. So again, thank you both so much for joining, and also a special thanks to our simultaneous interpreters and technicians. Lastly, I'd like to invite all the participants to fill out the survey and share your comments. For more information on our upcoming events and programs, please visit our website and social media pages, and we hope to see you at one of these events. Thank you so much for joining us today, and please take care.